Let me invite you all for this program, even though I am slightly removed from this area. And the first lecture would be by Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who needs no introduction. But in any case, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, a renowned pediatrician and a global expert in tuberculosis and HIV research, recently served as the WHO's chief scientist and previously as the Deputy Director General for Programs at ICM. Returning to India, she assumed the role of chairperson of the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation in February 2023. She serves on numerous global advisory boards, including CEPA and Tamil Nadu Climate Change Mission. At WHO, she played a key role in setting up COVAX to ensure equitable vaccine distribution during the COVID-19 pandemic. She is also the principal advisor to the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India. And may I request Madam to...
Very good morning to everyone, and thank you very much, Dr. Ravindra, for having hosted this session. I know it is being jointly hosted and it has been co-organized by MSSRF and the Institute of Math Science. And I think this is a really good example of two neighboring institutions collaborating. The two institutions are quite different, work on very different areas. But I think this is the age, the day to actually bring different disciplines together. What could not have been imagined in the past as disciplines, mathematics. Most biologists would think that, mathematics doesn't play much role and vice versa. But today, I think the power of especially computational technologies, as well as we've seen recently, how artificial intelligence and algorithms are making such a big difference. Machine learning algorithms are making a huge difference in discovery and research. And as you know, the Nobel Prize this year also went, one of the winners was the co-founder of Google, DeepMind. And one of the things, remarkable achievements of DeepMind has been the protein structure of thousands and thousands of proteins, which otherwise would have taken probably decades of painstaking research by scientists around the world. DeepMind has been able to completely describe the protein structure. This then opens up a whole lot of research, particularly into drug discovery as well as vaccine development. And one can hope that you would get much faster drug discovery going on now. And at other phases also during the drug discovery process, artificial intelligence could play a very important role. And I met someone recently who said that, because of those protein structures, they are now able to work on new drugs for tuberculosis, for example, which had really been very difficult in the past. So I think advances in technology need to be harnessed by us to solve the problems that we face, the societal problems, particularly since we are in India and, we need to identify what are our own problems and how do we use science and technology to solve them. Because we know that, for example, with the triple planetary threats today of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, all these three are threats not only to our livelihood and lives, but also to plants, animals, and all species that exist on Earth, as well as land, as well as water. Often we tend to forget what is in the water or in the oceans, but they're equally, if not more, at threat from these triple, what are called the triple planetary threats. And a species extinction, which used to happen at the speed of about 1 to 5 per year, which is a natural phenomenon, today has been speeded up 1,000 times. And it is predicted that if global warming keeps increasing, we have already breached the 1.5 degree mark that we were not supposed to breach. That's what Paris Agreement was all about. It was about keeping the global warming to less than 1.5 degrees over the, pre-industrial average. But we have last year was the first year, 23 and 24, we have already crossed a 1.5, and it is likely that we are on our way to 2 point, anywhere between 2.5 and 3. That's what scientists believe. And if rich countries like the US are going to cut back on their climate action, on mitigation, then naturally we are in for even worse outcomes. What will happen is that countries like India will suffer disproportionately. Countries in the tropics, the temperate countries will suffer less from global warming, though they will also be impacted. Everybody will be impacted by natural hazards. We know that the number of climatic hazards today has increased so much that whether it's the US or Europe or Asia or Africa, we are all facing these cyclones, floods, droughts, and so on. But the main impact of heat will be felt here, and it will be felt by humans, animals, and plants. So, while when we think about this, we can then understand why the One Health concept actually becomes very important. Because if you think only about one species, then you're actually missing the bigger picture. And in fact, the topic of this workshop is, focusing on microbes, which are obviously the omnipresent everywhere, including in our own bodies. We have billions and billions of bacteria. Majority of them are helpful. They're helping us. And only occasionally do we get bugs, which produce disease. So most of the time we are living in a symbiotic relationship. Similarly, in the soil, you have millions of microbes that we know nothing about, which the majority of which are beneficial. And when they get wiped out due to our actions, then that actually has negative consequences. So I think we're beginning to understand now that the application of a lot of chemicals into the soil and some of the modern agricultural techniques have actually resulted in a depletion of soil micronutrients, which again is very much linked to microbes. And therefore, this is then impacting the crops that we grow. And it has been now documented that over a period of time, the micronutrients, even in staple crops like rice and wheat and maize, have come down significantly. And that if you can improve the soil health, you can improve the plant micronutrient content, and that in turn can obviously improve human health, because we are getting our nutrients from what we eat. So if we are going to eat things which are very depleted in nutrients, we'll just be filling our stomachs, but we're not going to be well nourished as such. So the other side of that problem, of course, is the dietary diversity. So while in the past there were over 5,000 edible species that human beings used to consume, today 70% of what people eat around the world is rice, wheat, or maize. And even in that, the variability of the varieties is very, very low because of the use of commercially available hybrid varieties or high yielding varieties and so on. So over time, what has happened is that we have reduced considerably the diversity of plants in our diet. And this again, if you look at our traditional diets, if you look at even what the tribal people used to eat, they knew everything that was edible in their environment, right? In their forest or whatever was growing, they could immediately know which leaves, and that's how they ate. They used to go and collect from the forest everything that was edible, and including animal protein, which they used to kill small animals, and that was their source of protein. So they had actually very good, well-balanced diet. Today, they are dependent entirely on PDS, which definitely gives enough calories or more than enough calories, but does not give either protein or all the other vitamins and minerals that we need. So both lack of dietary diversity as well as overdependence on a few crops, and in those few crops, the nutrients coming down, I think, is the big threat to nutrition security, not just for India, but globally. As you know, the number of food insecure people has not been coming down. In fact, it's gone up in the recent years, partly because of the conflict, the COVID, as well as climate change, what was called the 3 Cs. COVID may no longer be a threat, but certainly conflicts and climate change continue to be. So, so when we think about, what other impacts, the big global threats to health, certainly climate change and global warming is one. Another one is antimicrobial resistance, and this again is linked very much to what I think you will be discussing, because antimicrobial resistance means bacteria, fungi, or other pathogens becoming resistant to the chemicals that are used normally to treat infections. And there are many, many studies that have projected that by 2050, if we continue like this, we'll run out of antibiotics, that there will be huge increase in mortality due to infections, both in animals and humans, and of course, that will lead to a lot of economic loss. Antimicrobial resistance can also wipe out animals that are bred for consumption, livestock, poultry, fish, aquaculture, and so on. So it is a big economic threat in addition to being, of course, a threat to life. And the reason that that's increasing also is multifactorial. It's not any one factor, but it's the overuse of antibiotics by humans, but also use in the agriculture and livestock and aquaculture industries. And this is routinely used as a growth promoter. Adding antibiotics to feed is very common because it's believed that a small dose could prevent infections. And that is again related to the fact that a lot of this type of farming is now done very unhygienically. You cramp in a lot of animals into a closed space. There's a lot of potential for disease, for infections spreading, and therefore then the use of antibiotics to try and prevent that. So what it ends up doing, of course, is that it exposes soil bacteria to small doses of antibiotics, and this in turn could lead to those bacteria becoming resistant. And as you know, there are many ways in which resistance genes can be transferred from one bacterium to another, maybe through plasmid or maybe not. And therefore, this can then find its way into the same resistance gene going into other pathogens which infect human beings. A few years ago, if you remember, there was several years ago actually, there was the discovery of the NDM1 gene, which was called the New Delhi metalloproteinase 1 gene. It was done by a PhD student from IIT Madras. And when the paper was published in the Lancet, I think the only unfortunate part was there that it was called New Delhi metalloproteinase, because the tendency is to name some new bug after the origin or wherever it was discovered. So in fact, in WHO, there is a guideline saying you should not do that because it ends up stigmatizing places. So this is why COVID was not called, Wuhan virus or something like that, because there are guidelines for how it was called SARS-CoV-2 based on the phylogenetic characteristics of the virus. So this was published as a New Delhi metalloproteinase gene, which was conferring resistance to a whole class of antibiotics, and is responsible actually for a lot of very severe drug-resistant infections in hospitals. But at that time, it created a huge outcry, and India actually was officially very upset that such a thing had been discovered, and was trying to prove that this may not have arisen in India and so on. So this poor PhD student faced quite a lot of challenges at that time and his guide having published this paper. But the fact is that today everybody accepts this gene is widespread in India and elsewhere, and it confers AMR. So I think again that's very much linked to and today it's quite common using the genomic technologies that we have now to be able to look at wastewater, to do environmental surveillance. During COVID, that became very common, whether it was sewage from airplanes, to track how the virus was traveling around the world, or Bangalore city, for example, is now using genomic surveillance not only for COVID, but they're trying to use it for other pathogens as well. and the Tata Institute for Genomics and Society TIGS, which is on the NCBS campus, is actually, and NCBS and Indian Institute of Science are involved with the Bangalore Municipal Corporation actually to do that. So there are many applications today where you can actually use these techniques to have a surveillance, have an idea of what is in the environment. Because if it's in the environment, it's going to get into human either through the food chain or through some other means. So environmental surveillance, I think, is going to become more important in the future. Similarly, I suppose that soil is also a very good source and a good medium to actually study, to see and to see what the health of the soil is like. So, as I mentioned, the healthy soil is very important for us, which means you need a lot of organic matter, you need a lot of microbes actually for a healthy soil. And just like a human microbiome consists of, it is varying from person to person, but today people are able to distinguish between a healthy and an unhealthy microbiome, and the huge amount of research going on in actually trying to design treatments to correct your microbiome, which may be responsible for a number of diseases, including even mental health disorders are linked now to gut health. So similarly, the microbes in the soil will definitely play a big role in the what is the the nutritional content of the soil, as well as other characteristics of soil. We know that today one of the reasons we have flooding in many places is because the topsoil is denuded. Even the landslides in Wayanad and other sort of hotspots, even in the Himalayas and Uttarakhand, partly because we have denuded, we have depleted the forest cover and all other vegetation. So you have nothing to hold back when the water comes rushing down and the soil just gets washed away. So this has multiple bad effects. One is that the topsoil is all going away in the water. The second is, of course, that people are impacted, because when you have a landslide or you have a flood, then people's lives get very badly impacted, as we read every day in the newspapers. And it further depletes the soil of that region and makes it difficult to cultivate. So I think with climate change, some of these things are going to increase, but more importantly is, what are we doing? We can't blame it all on climate change and say that we are the victims, because we have actually done development in a way in which we have really exacerbated some of these environmental problems by building everywhere, by cutting off, the water paths so that the water can no longer flow. And you can't stop water. So if you cut it somewhere, it has to go somewhere else. It's going to enter your homes because it's lost its natural path. Tamil Nadu, for example, is one state that was fully interconnected with lakes and bunds and rivers and canals. And during the Chola time, we had one of the most advanced waterways and water systems in the world for irrigation, and never had any flooding or anything like that. But today, because of all the construction we've done, we experience floods on a regular basis. So I think the whole, similarly in the hills, because we have deforested, we are building buildings where we should not be building them. And once in a while, then we see a huge flood and a huge landslide, just wipe away. And unnecessarily, so many people lose their lives. So I think this is actually One Health really very broadly is to think about things more holistically and to understand that interventions in one area or one thing will have repercussions across many, and ultimately will have health repercussions on us. So if the quality of our food keeps declining due to a number of reasons, of course, now we are over dependent on processed food. That's another very big risk. And like I mentioned, the lack of dietary diversity. So some of the problems that we face today of malnutrition, which includes undernutrition and overnutrition, both spectrum we are having. And the third element is the micronutrient deficiencies or anemia. And all these three, obesity and overweight, are increasing. Undernutrition is decreasing, but very slowly. So our stunting rates are falling extremely slowly. and we still have about 20% of adults whose BMI is less than 18.5, so they are also undernourished. And in children, it's higher. And then we have about 50%, or now the estimate is around 42%, according to ICMR, of adult women, and about 20% of adult men who are anemic. And only a third of these are due to iron deficiency anemia. So, what are the rest due to then? The rest are due to lack of other nutrients in the diet, but some of it is, also genetic factors, thalassemias and sickle cell anemia and all that. But the diet, so if you look at the global burden of disease and what they regularly update their analyses both of disease burden and risk factors, the number one risk factor to health today is unhealthy diet globally, but also in India. And the number two risk to health is pollution, particularly air pollution. So 9 out of 10 people globally breathe unhealthy air. And of course, almost all Indians, except for maybe few people living in some remote areas, we are all breathing unhealthy air as per the WHO standards. This sets up cascading inflammatory pathways and leads to a lot of non-communicable diseases. So I think going back to square one, the root of a lot of diseases is what we eat. What we eat is what we grow, essentially. And so what we grow, I think we come back to how do we grow it, where do we grow it, and so on. So there's huge amount of interest now. You hear a lot about organic farming, natural farming, and so on. But what exactly does it mean scientifically? What are we trying to achieve? And so MSSRF has been working on this for a long time because the foundation had already recognized that climate change and all these interconnected factors was going to be a very big threat to agriculture, which is a source of livelihood, for half our population. And of course, apart from the fact that it feeds everybody, and that these threats, if they're not addressed, then they're going to lead to further impoverishment of farmers and, of course, affecting the food supply chains and so on, food security. And so I think we got to go use our scientific techniques now to really understand what does it mean when you say stop using chemicals and go to more natural ways of farming. The fear of always is for the farmer that the yield will reduce. And if the yield reduces, that means the income goes down, right? So again, we need policies which can empower them or at least support them during the transition period from a very highly chemical-based agriculture to a more natural. And there are many different experiments going on in many parts. So I think that studying scientifically and showing what the changes are. I was listening to some things on the YouTube, which are really talking about if you have earthworms and other creatures which bore through the earth, they create channels, and the channels then hold water so that when it rains, the water can actually go down deep rather than be on the surface and run off. So there are so many different advantages to having a lot of organisms in the soil. I remember seeing earthworms so commonly when we were children. It's very difficult to see an earthworm now, when you walk in a garden. So from earthworms to things which are invisible, the diversity of life, has changed. Pollinators are at threat. There are many, many things which are at threat, and each one is interconnected. If you put certain kinds of plants, you can attract more pollinators. If you use a lot of chemicals, obviously you're going to kill them. People kill snakes, but if you don't have snakes, the rats are going to overrun and become threats. And similarly, we lost all our vultures because of a drug called diclofenac, which is used to treat arthritis in cattle. And when the vultures ate the cattle carcasses, they died. So 97-98% of our vulture population actually is gone now. So vultures not being there means there's nobody to eat the carcasses. The carcasses are rotting. That is again fueling a lot of spread of infection. Stray dogs carry that infection and so on. So we don't realize that one species, whether it's a small frog or it could be an insect, or it could be the vulture. We think, okay, one species goes, what's the big, difference? There are so many other birds, but actually the kind of cycle it sets off is very difficult to replace with any other species. So this is why you got to study all these things quite holistically, not very with a very narrow lens, but at the same time apply rigorous scientific techniques, I think, to study them. And this is where you need the interdisciplinarity and coming together, and that's why it's so good today for these next couple of days that you'll have, I think, people coming from very different backgrounds. And Prabha, you were saying 29 different institutions. It's very nice. So thank you to Arijit and Jagan and Prabha and Dr. Ravindran for having thought of this topic and also to targeting it to young people. It should be very interactive. So maybe we can have a couple of questions now, but keep it interactive and think of research questions which can be addressed. Because at the end of this, if we can stimulate some good research coming out of this, that will be the idea actually, and also some new collaborations, new friendships, and so on. So with that, I think I'll stop. And Arijit, if you want to open it up, we can. But if you're running out of time, then we can proceed. Yeah.
Questions? Anybody?
Any comments or questions by anybody? Any of that?
Say yes. Any comments? Remarks?
Okay, perhaps as the day goes on, there'll be more.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Sir.
Yeah, so very nice talk, and thanks for sharing the thoughts. I feel when the COVID epidemic started, the world came to a standstill, and everybody respected that small microorganisms are to be viewed so important, and they can change the economy, they can stall the economy. But the same way now, like you rightly mentioned, the climate change is the next big threat. So as people who belong to the world, is there something drastic we can do? Like, say even for a day, if we bring things to a standstill and pause and think about the climate change, is there something that we can do? I wonder.
Yes, I don't have an answer to that. You're right. During the pandemic, everything came to a standstill, and people started worrying about this one, virus. But then ultimately we overcame it, and then we went back, to square one. And today, as you see, the geopolitics is not exactly supportive to addressing climate change or other health threats in a globally coordinated, collaborative way. People want to go their own ways, which is the wrong thing at this stage. We have to actually come together. So I think as scientists, we can do our bit in the sense that you do the research, of course, and to show what is important, but also speak out about these things. Yeah, because I think more scientists need to really speak up because scientists are respected. I think one of the surveys done after COVID showed that scientists were the most respected in the community, doctors also, and the least respected were journalists and politicians.
Any other comment? Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming to IMSC. It's just a privilege to listen to you. So, in general, I'm curious. So, there has been attempts like agroecology in some of the South American countries, where people have tried to kind of combine ecology with agriculture to think of, as you said, of the more holistic approach. Like, I don't know if in India such attempts have been made. I mean, of course, I'm asking because you have been involved with many of these endeavors, and if it's possible, how should we go about doing it? And as like people who are from a quantitative background, like me or others here, who do not have any exposure to this, how should we approach this? Your inputs would be really valuable. Thank you.
So, yeah, thanks for that question. Very important. I'm not an expert, obviously, on agroecology or any of these things, but I think there are many experiments going on. You're absolutely right. So what is important today is that for a policy to happen, we need some strong evidence. And generally, the evidence should not be just some a theoretical paper, but it should translate into what could be an impact on economy, what could be an impact maybe on the income of individual people, or what could be an impact on the environment. And so this is why now nature-based solutions are being talked of quite a bit, because there are also sustainability targets and all that. Even the private sector has, and of course, government does have targets both for sustainable development goals as well as for climate goals, biodiversity goals. So I think we need to also think about how does our research fit into answering any of those questions. For example, if we are far away from a particular goal, let's say on food nutrition security, we are very far away. Food security, we can say we are there. Nutrition security, we are far away. We keep on year after year saying, oh, why do we have so many anemic people? Why do we? So this is the answer could come from research like this, which has never before tried to connect the plants, the soil, animals, environment, and humans. So because medical people will work only on the humans, agricultural scientists will work only on the agricultural side. We need to, I read a paper where we need to replicate it, of course, but in somewhere in Malawi, they added selenium to the soil and they found that selenium levels in maize went up, and then that translated into better selenium levels in humans. Selenium is very important for a number of functions, including immunity. So this may not be true for all, like zinc and iron. By enriching the soil, does it translate into better crop levels and health outcomes? So I think, and then the carbon, how much carbon are we being able to conserve in the soil, or capture? So carbon capture today is very important. That again, our national and global goals are there for how much CO2 we have to reduce. So there are offsets and things like that. There are carbon credits. People can earn money now by capturing carbon. And the government is also coming out with something called green credits, because you talked about agroecology. So there are also opportunities for these farmers who are otherwise earning very little to have additional income. But for that, we need to do the calculations. If you have a planted tree, you cut it after 3 years, it's not going to give you any carbon credits. So you have to calculate how much does a mangrove tree give you in terms of carbon, or some other tree, or some other way of doing agriculture. Are you capturing enough carbon? And it's not just carbon, it's methane, it's nitrogen oxide, it's many other pollutants. The climate, gases which contribute to climate change. If you can reduce, for example, a third of greenhouse gas emissions come from the agriculture sector. Okay, so of course we can't overnight change things in the agriculture sector, but the fact is that it's producing a lot of greenhouse gases. So any technology that can reduce, either from livestock, because they exhale a lot of methane, right, when they belch. So there's a lot of research going on how do you reduce methane from cows by putting something in the feed, and also from plants like rice. How do you do rice differently, grow rice in a different way where you can reduce methane emissions. So there's a lot of research can be done which will have very practical implications.
Thank you. Soumya, thank you for a nice talk.
Yes.
I have a short question.
Ah.
I keep hearing that after COVID, the allergy has increased because people become over clean. They wash their hands with soap and antiseptic too much. So that kills the bacterium and so on. Are there studies to prove this?
Allergies in general are increasing. What did go up a lot after COVID was that, especially for young children who were protected, for those few years, they never went out. They did not go to preschool, etc. So they didn't get the usual exposure to viruses. So for a few years, if you see the data, the RSV, influenza, and everything else came down except for COVID, because there's global surveillance on all these viruses. And immediately after COVID, when the schools reopened, children started going back, it came back again. So yes, I think exposure to viruses in your early life is important. You get immunity to a number of these, which protect you later. But in terms of allergies, there are many reasons. But I'm not sure there's a relation with COVID having increased that. But it could be the same thing, that you had no exposure and then suddenly you have a lot of exposure. There is that hygiene hypothesis that talks about cleanliness, but that's a disputed hypothesis.
Thank you. Yeah. So there's a question from there.
Yeah, very good morning, ma'am. So it was nice to hear talk from you. So you are talking about antimicrobial resistance, right, ma'am? So I would like to know about your comments on biofilm formations in different. Means it is biofilm formation is also a upcoming research field to work more towards the antimicrobial resistance, right? So how? What is your comment about that, ma'am?
Yeah, definitely. I think biofilms is an area of active research interest. And I'm not up to date with the literature on biofilms just now, so I may not be able to give you a lot of details. But to address antimicrobial resistance, we have to approach it in many, many ways. So, on the one side, we have to try and reduce the occurrence of more by changing our practices, prescribing practices, consumption, like I said, growth, promotion, we shouldn't use veterinary side, etc. But also the other ways of approaching it. So whether it is biofilms, whether it is phage, bacteriophage treatments, that's another active area of research. Today, using mRNA technology, one could develop monoclonal antibodies that could target some of these. There's a whole area of research there. And then, of course, new drug development is also needed as we lose some of the antibiotics, that we have today. So I think all of these areas are important areas for research, and biofilm is definitely one of them.